Was Sarah really sister of Abraham? If she was Abraham's sister, why doesn't she appear in the genealogy of Will? The fact that Abraham was married to his own sister was not wrong. Well, after we made a video about Sarah's story, we received a lot of such questions around here. Even some people even sent comments by categorically stating that Sarah was not Abraham's sister, but only a close relative, and that there is supposedly a mistake of biblical interpretation at this point. But this is not such a simple matter, guys. And that's what we'll talk about in this video. We can start by saying that, in fact, the Bible says that Sarah was Abraham's sister by her father. This is recorded in Genesis chapter 20 and verse 12. The biblical verse shows how Abraham himself said that Sarah was his sister, daughter of his father, but not of his mother. But this verse has generated a lot of discussion among scholars about what their best interpretation should be. Some commentators suggest that perhaps Sarah was not necessarily a direct sister of Abraham. According to these people, Sarah could be her niece or even her foster sister, either at the time of marriage or prior to him. And just to contextualize better here, we know that at least twice Abraham said that Sarah was her sister. The first occurred during her pilgrimage in Egypt, as we read in Genesis chapter 12. Abraham asked Sarah that at that time she was called Sarai, to say in Egypt that she was her sister, instead of saying that she was her wife. This happened because Abraham considered that his wife's beauty could endanger him. He believed that when the Egyptians saw Sarah, they would kill him to take her for a woman. Then Abraham entered Egypt saying that Sarah was her sister, and she, in turn, supported her husband's information. The second time Abraham said that Sarah was her sister was in the city of Gerar. The episode was very similar to that occurred in Egypt. He was afraid that the men of Generating wanted to kill him to be with his wife. And then, again, he said in Generating that Sarah was his sister. In both Egypt and Generating, the attitudes of Abraham when hiding his relationship brought great problems. In Egypt, Pharaoh took Sarah to her house, thinking she was a free woman. And in Generating, King Abimelech took Sarah to his harem. In both places, Abraham was harshly scolded when his lie was discovered. Even no worse happened to Sarah because God didn't allow it. But it was in Generating that Abraham explained exactly that. In fact, Sarah was her sister, and then became her wife. And in this sense, he said, in verse, this explanation of Abraham did not make his error less shameful, okay? Abraham made a mistake. He was cowardly. And we can even say that on these two occasions he was lacking faith to that man who became known as the father of faith. But returning to the biblical text, note that he brings the explicit statement of Abraham himself, saying that Sarah was really his sister. And some commentators have observed that the Hebrew word translated by sister can also be applied in a broader sense to refer to a relative. This could include a niece, a cousin, and so on. And Abraham himself, for example, he speaks of Lot, his nephew, as if he were his brother there in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 8. But undoubtedly, the main meaning of this Hebrew word is even that of blood sister, daughter of them country. Then Abraham added that Sarah was her father's daughter and not her mother. That is, Abraham clarified that his kinship with Sarah was only by her father and not a mother. And the Hebrew word translated by daughter can also refer to a daughter foster, and even wider, to a granddaughter, or even a daughter-in-law. And that's why defining if Sarah was Abraham's sister to be her father's blood daughter is not so easy. And in view of this difficulty, scholars have presented at least two main alternatives. The first alternative, interpretative, is the one that follows the most natural reading of the biblical text and considers that Sarah was really sister of Abraham by her father. That is, according to this interpretation, Sarah was half a sister of Abraham. Daughter of will, have will. And this position has been the most adopted by Christian scholars. Although some people find it strange that Abraham, the great patriarch of Israel, has married his own sister. But the fact that Abraham married his own sister should not be seen as problematic in the light of the context in which he lived. First, Abraham was created in Mesopotamia under laws and pagan customs. At that time, weddings with close relatives, including brothers, It was not only tolerated, but often something expected. Second, God prohibited this kind of relationship between brothers just 500 years after Abraham, when he gave the law to Moses. So Abraham could not be held responsible for not fitting into a law that was revealed long after his death. And a question that is sometimes raised against this interpretation is that at no time was Sarah being cited among the children of Will. When the Bible records the descent of Will, only Abraham, Aram, and Nahor are mentioned as their children there in Genesis chapter 11. However, this problem can be easily solved considering that, overall, ancient genealogies prioritized children and omitted the women's daughters. So this kind of thing is relatively common in old documents. A second interpretation of this question suggests that Sarah was Abraham's foster sister. And within that interpretation, there are some variations. Some believe that Sarah was a niece of Abraham, daughter of Aram and granddaughter of Will. The idea is that, as Aram died as a young man, his father may have adopted his grandchildren as children. This then made Sarah, niece of Abraham, his legitimate sister by adoption. But since the biblical text says that Iran was the father of Lo, Milcah, and Ska, usually who adopts this interpretation understands that Ska was an alternative name for Sarai. In this way, Abraham and Nahor would have married their brother Aaron's orphan daughters, as Nahor also married Milcah. Although double names were common in biblical times, the problem with this assumption is that in no part of the Bible there is any indicative that Sarai and Iscah were names that designated the same person. Even so, many Jewish interpreters adopt this interpretation. Therefore, it is present in several rabbinic comments. Even Jewish historian Flavio Josefo. Others believe that Sarah was not necessarily Abram's niece, but she was a girl who was adopted by having her marriage with Abram. This would imply the fact that Sarah could be from a close relative to someone who had no blood bond with Abram. And this hypothesis is based on some archaeological discoveries made in the region of ancient Mesopotamia. The Assyriologist Ephraim Spacer, for example, noted that the Zuhanians, who were an influential people in Arabic, had a sister relationship. And in this relationship, the husband adopted his wife as a sister to make his legal relationship stronger and solemn. In other words, making his wife a legitimate daughter of her father. Her husband increased the authority and position of her marriage to her. And it seems that, as he was also a foster brother of his wife, the husband exercised even more authority over her. And on the other side, when becoming a foster sister, the wife also enjoyed a greater legal protection and social status. But it is impossible to say that this kind of relationship existed in Abraham's family, who was not a native of Aran, but was natural to Ur. And in all this, what is the best interpretation then? Well, here we need to admit that all interpretations have some meaning. But while it is not impossible for Sarah to be an adopted sister of Abraham, whether her niece or not, she remains true that the natural reading of the biblical text favors the interpretation that Sarah was Abraham's sister by her father. As has been said, the biblical text very naturally states that Sarah was half-sister of Abraham, daughter of Will. And although the words sister and daughter also have a broader application, their main senses remain these, that is, sister and daughter. And the fact that rabbinic comments argue that Sarah was a niece of Abraham should not to solve the question in favor of this interpretation. Because within the Jewish tradition itself, there are writings that have considerable importance, and also reaffirm that Sarah was really sister of Abraham by her father. So, to argue that Sarah was a niece of Abraham, or an adopted daughter of Will, have not exactly to contradict the biblical text, but means depending on a greater arrangement in the meaning of the text to accommodate this interpretation. Therefore, most Christian biblical interpreters continue to prefer the interpretation that Sarah was really sister of Abraham by her father. It's okay. I hope you could understand.